Our next speaker is Dick Russell. He is a prolific author, an activist, and an environmentalist. He's the author of The Man Who Knew Too Much, and according to the research I did, he did 17 years of research, over 100 interviews, including James Jesus Angleton, before he released that book. Today, Dick is going to be speaking on Richard Case Nagell, the newly released Stasi files, and the Kennedy assassination. If you would, ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome Dick Russell.
Good to see all of you. Before I get into telling you a spy story, I do urge you to check out The Inheritance, the book that has been mentioned already by Chris Fulton. I wrote the foreword to it. It's a pretty amazing story, and I think it's true. Also, I want to say that I think that Barbara Honegger's suggestion about we need to look at the ultra-right wing in this conspiracy in addition to the CIA and the mob and the Cuban exiles is also true. But I want to talk to you today. Can I ask how many in this room know who Richard Case Nagell was? Okay, so quite a few. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on his past, which is all in this book, The Man Who Knew Too Much, that I initially published in 1992 and came out again in a revised edition in 2003. But briefly, I'll tell you who he was before I get into some remarkable new information that's starting to come out about him. I first heard of him in 1975. I was one of the first investigative journalists, probably the first to really spend several years on the trail of interviewing a lot of people, most of whom I eventually wasn't sure if they were telling me the truth or not, even if I believed them at first. But Nagell was one that I certainly did believe, and I heard about him at the home of Richard Popkin, who wrote The Second Oswald. I went out there for the Village Voice on an assignment to check out this man who was saying he'd solved the Kennedy assassination. And one of the reasons he was saying that was this guy named Richard Nagell, who lived in Los Angeles. And at first, I didn't take it all that seriously, and I went back to New York, where I lived at the time, and started looking at this notebook that had been released under the Freedom of Information Act to Bernard Fensterwald Jr., who in turn passed it along to Popkin. And I started looking through it, and it had these listings for the Cuban embassy in Mexico City and for the Fair Play for Cuba committee. And I thought, wow, this guy is interesting in terms of what I knew about what had been in Oswald's notebook when he was picked up on the day of the assassination. And so I went to El Paso. My parents lived there at the time, and I started interviewing a number of the cop who had arrested him. What had happened was that Nagell had walked into a bank in El Paso on September 20th, 2 months and 2 days before the assassination. And he had shot 2 holes in the ceiling of the bank after approaching a teller, and then walked outside and waited to get himself arrested. So I went to El Paso first to interview these cops and the FBI, and try to interview the FBI. They wouldn't do it. The policeman that I interviewed there, named Jim Bundren, who had arrested him outside the bank, he didn't tell me this the first time I saw him, but later told me that he'd been at Nagell's arraignment on early November of '63, shortly before the assassination, and Nagell had turned to him and said, or the cop looked at him first and said, you didn't really try to rob that bank, did you? You'd been charged with attempted bank robbery. And Nagell said, you're a pretty smart cop, aren't you? And then Nagell said, well, I'll just tell you this, I wouldn't want to be in Dallas right now. Now, the policeman never forgot that, because obviously Nagell had some kind of advance warning that something was going to go down. So I then knocked on a door in Manhattan Beach, California in the fall of '75, where Popkin had an address for Richard Nagell, and this guy kind of peered through the door and with reluctance let me in. And I remember he tape recorded me. He wouldn't let me tape him that day, and he wouldn't tell me a whole lot. But it was the beginning of a relationship that I came to believe was that this guy was probably the most significant living witness. He's no longer living, and I'll tell you that story in a little bit, to what had happened that day. There was a military ID card in his possession that I found in some files in Washington that Mary Farrell, the great researcher here in Dallas, found extremely significant, because it was an Oswald ID, a photocopy of it. And it had the same, it was a military uniform service identification card that had appeared one time in a book by Judy Bonner. But it had a different picture and a different signature. And what was remarkable about it was couldn't have been a faked card, because there was an overstamp on the original card, and on this card there was not. So this was another indication to me that this guy knew Oswald and obviously was in on some things. So I'll tell you briefly about how Nagell was railroaded through jail. A new judge came into his case shortly after the assassination, and it turned out to be a man named Homer Thornberry, who was a very close friend of Lyndon Johnson's. I had been in the motorcade that day. He was a congressman. Suddenly, the judge in Nagell's case retires, and Thornberry comes back to Texas, where he's from, and takes over the case. Now, that in itself is pretty weird. And he then did everything he could to prevent anything coming up at the trial, although Nagell tried, about the assassination of President Kennedy. So 4.5 years he's railroaded through prison. And he's visited by a Garrison investigator in 1967, and he's suddenly released in 1968. Just bam, overnight, he's let go. And the story I want to tell you today is about what happened to him after that. Because it was 2 months later, he ends up on a train in East Germany, which was still communist at the time. And suddenly he's taken off the train and arrested, just like he'd been in the US before. So is he there on some kind of mission? Who is this guy? He had been claiming that he was a double agent for the CIA and for the KGB. You should know that he was the youngest soldier promoted to get a battlefield promotion to captain during the Korean War. He went on into military intelligence and to work for the CIA. And I'm not going to get into all the details about his story today, but I do want to relate to you what he told the East Germans, because it's a really interesting story. And these files are just beginning to see the light of day. There's a fellow who lives in Europe named Peter Lemkin. Some of you may have heard of him. He's been researching this case for a long time. And he's been the conduit for the release of getting the East Germans to, now that they're no longer communist, and protecting all this stuff, to release these files. And then I've been seeing what's in them little by little. So I haven't seen everything yet, but I'll guarantee you they're interesting. So he's taken off this train, bound for West Berlin, on June 10th of '68, 3 o'clock in the morning. It makes a routine stop by this small town inside of East Germany for just a standard onboard inspection of transit visas. Now, Nagell had not gotten a transit visa because he was actually not intending to go as far as West Berlin, as he stated to the East Germans that he feared that the CIA would be waiting for him there in West Berlin to kill him. So he says that he's come as a friend, not an enemy, that he's come to East Germany only to go to either the Cuban or North Korean embassies to seek political asylum, that he's had it with the United States. This is a story he's been telling for some time in different locations, which we'll get to. So he's arrested traveling with a credit card, which is very rare in those days, and also about the equivalent of $3,300 in European currency. He'd come out of Switzerland. He's traveling really light as far as his clothing and heavy as far as documents. He had no spy items on him, not even a camera. And he gets locked up, and after 3 days of interrogation, he's sent to a prison in East Berlin. And he's charged formally with espionage, present and past, against the German Democratic Republic, as it was called at the time. So they've been very suspicious of him at first. They test his toiletry articles to see if they contain explosives or secret invisible inks or poisons, and if his notebooks have any hidden writing. They don't find anything suspicious in these regards about anything. They put him in a cell with a guy that is a stool pigeon, who's going to try to find out if he speaks English, and he's going to try to get to Nagell to tell him secrets. I sometimes say Nagell and sometimes I say Nagell because he actually pronounced it both ways, but it has 2 L's on the end of it. So today I'll probably say Nagell. So after each interrogation by the East Germans, they usually have a theme to the questions. And these are often, very wide-ranging because Nagell takes it to that place when answering. They develop these typed or handwritten points about what he's said. Now, there are also, I should say, CIA records on Nagell. There's FBI records, but these East German ones are several thousand pages so far, and they're really damned interesting. He's got his service record in there. He's got his citations, his commendations. He received a Bronze Star in Korea and the Korean War and three Purple Hearts. He has a paper granting him a top security or higher clearance. He's even got his baptism certificate with him. And he's got a certificate from the Monterey Language School with a diploma in Japanese. He says that the CIA, this is what he says to the East Germans, they wanted me out of the way due to my involvement in matters related to the murder of John F. Kennedy. They conduct these interrogations in English and transcribe them into German. They tape record the sessions. And it's interesting that they spend much more time on the 1950s and general questions about the structure of American intelligence in the 1960s than they do specifically on the assassination. He gives them an 80-page long article by William Turner that was published in Ramparts magazine on the Garrison investigation. And they translate this entire article. So they're obviously very interested in it. And he also handwrites or brings a page. I don't know if it was typed at the time or handwritten, but it's called CIA Contacts and Pertinent Matters and Activities in 1968. And here he describes what happens. He gets released from prison at Fort Leavenworth. And then he's told to go, he says he won't talk to an FBI agent. They tell him, he meets with some people and they tell him, go to New York and meet with your CIA contact there, who he knows as a Mr. Buell, B-U-E-H-E-L. That's not his real name. And he's told that the CIA had pulled a lot of strings to finally get you out of prison. So he's trying to find the whereabouts, what happened to his wife and kids, he had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and a Japanese wife, and they have completely disappeared. He's not told where they are. He thinks they're maybe somewhere in Europe. And he says, that the CIA guy, Buell tells him that we've done our very best to extricate you from the very beginning. We're really sorry we couldn't do it. We're going to get you a job with the Veterans Administration. And then he meets with Jim Garrison. Jones Harris, who's a researcher in New York, still around, an independent researcher, has been in touch with Garrison and contacts Nagell through his sister and says, Garrison wants to meet with you in Central Park in New York. So Nagell goes. And so Garrison tells him that he thinks that the CIA is planning to kill him. He's talked to William R. Martin, who is one of Garrison's people who's interviewed Nagell in prison. And Nagell says, Garrison starts to give him names, and he says, I never knew of Clay Shaw or Jacob Ruby, prior to the publication of their names. But there were others that he did know. David Ferry, Carlos Bringuer, Gordon Novell, Sergio Arcacha, and Guy W. Bannister. But he was sure of only one of those individuals having met Oswald, who was indeed David Ferry. They talk about various poisons that the CIA uses to kill people. They discuss the use of silencers, mufflers, and various types of firearms. He meets twice with Garrison using a code name, and then goes on his way and heads off on a plane very shortly thereafter to Switzerland under instructions from the CIA. Now, what's he doing over there? Does he have an assignment to penetrate go into East Germany and he's on some kind of mission, and I still don't know to this day what that mission was, but he was certainly on one, and the East Germans suspected it. Or they would certainly suspect, whether he was trying to, he's traveling with false passports. And during one interrogation session, Nagell says, there were 5 friends who were, after meeting Garrison, he says, there were 5 friends who were with me in the CIA who have died in the meantime. One jumped out of a hotel room, another was hit by a car, 3 others died as a result of heart attacks. All of these were young persons in good health. And then the East Germans start asking him, especially about his earlier years in military intelligence. And he talks about a period when he went to work for the CIA in the mid-1950s in Los Angeles, where they had an office with 6 employees there. And then he talks about going into what was called field operations intelligence. And elsewhere, Nagell talked about FOI as an organization of the military, a branch of counterintelligence so secret that if you mentioned its name, you could be court-martialed. So there's another branch, though, within FOI that's even more significant, and I think significant to the assassination. He describes a contact, a man I'd never heard of before named Marvin Stone. If anybody knows this name, tell me sometime afterwards. He was director of the International News Service in the Far East and was based at the time in Tokyo. Had definitely connections to the CIA and to military intelligence. So Oswald and Nagell meet for the first time in Japan. Oswald is in the Marines there. Nagell enlists him he said first Oswald's walking up and down the street in front of the Russian embassy, and supposedly he wants to go in there and have some coins identified. And he's enlisted by Nagell into a plan to try to get a Soviet colonel inside the embassy who was with the GRU, not the KGB, named Nikolai Arashkin, to defect. And this was the first operation. Nagell said he had a casual but purposeful acquaintance with Oswald in Japan. Now, there's a lot of discussion with the East Germans about this group within FOI called Z, Z-E-D. And its commanding officer, who was a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Jack Kennan. And Nagell is part of this 20-person Z unit hidden within FOI, which itself was hidden within the counterintelligence corps of the military. And they were involved in various very controversial things over there. They kidnapped a guy named Yuri Rostverov, who ends up coming over to the CIA. He was a KGB guy at the time in Japan. A guy named Emmett Dugan. I don't know if you ever heard of this, but he was connected to the Arashkin plan, and his body was found in Tokyo Bay. He was part of this Z outfit, but was suspected of planning to defect to China. The Dugan murder has never been solved. And Nagell tells his interrogators that nobody is ever going to find any documents on Z because it was a super secret, special forces, dirty tricks, wet operations, meaning assassinations, denied operations group, and there was never any paperwork generated. Now, Z was established, who put Kennan in charge by a man named Charles Willoughby. Charles Willoughby was the spy master for General MacArthur during World War II and the Korean War. He was a fascist. He was an ultra-right-wing guy who ended up living here in Texas many years later. His original name, because he was born in Germany, was Adolf Sheppy Wiedenbach. Now, in 1975, after I wrote my first piece for the Village Voice about the assassination, I got an anonymous letter. And it was not signed, and it came from a guy who said, "You are now part of the great game of trying to solve the Kennedy assassination. It's tantamount to playing Russian roulette." And he says, our Canadian computers discovered links to the man who masterminded the assassination to a fellow named Sheppy Wiedenbach, who had ties to certain. He didn't elaborate on it. He said, "But if you want to contact me, put a classified ad in the Village Voice saying, Brooklyn waiter, I'm waiting." Now, I never did this. I wish I had, in retrospect, but I couldn't figure out. This seemed like a crank thing. Who was Sheppy Wiedenbach anyway? So years later, when I started researching I waited many years on Nagell, and I met with him many times in Los Angeles, primarily in the late 1970s. Not many times, but maybe 5 times. And more he would reveal some of the secrets that he knew. And then the Sheppy Wiedenbach name, my wife at the time ended up looking up something and finding out that this was the original name of Charles Willoughby. So I am convinced, and there's a lot about this in my book that I don't have time to go into, but that Willoughby, along with high-level people in the CIA, Texas oil people like the Hunt family, and the mob and Cuban exiles were behind the assassination of President Kennedy. Made to look like that Willoughby, along with not the CIA per se, but high enough up, perhaps Dulles, Angleton, I believe, along with lower-level operatives like David Phillips and people in the mob and Cuban exiles who posed as Castro agents in looking to convince Oswald, who was playing his own game. But I believe Oswald, I've come to believe Oswald was CIA, and Nagell said he certainly had CIA connections, and that there was a plot that was fomented with Oswald in the summer of '63, involving these two Cuban exiles who used the war names of Angel and Leopoldo. And those weren't their real names. They were the same names used when, you remember this visit to the Sylvia Odio's home in that fall with a guy calling himself Leon Oswald. But they were definitely involved with Oswald in this plan, which I believe was, they talked about killing Kennedy, but the actual idea behind this was to make it look like Castro was behind it, when in fact it was the right-wing Cubans and the fascist elements that were pulling this off. The Nagell alias, remember when Oswald was first picked up, almost simultaneously, coming out of Army intelligence was a file on Alex Nagell, which was a name that Oswald had used, and not just Oswald. That it was really, the Nagell name was not, had nothing to do with Fidel. It was an operational name that derives from two things, I believe. One was it was given to him. Nagell said, if you divide that name into 2 syllables, you'll be able to figure out who gave it to him. And one day I figured out that the last 3 letters of Nagell, or sometimes the way Nagell used his name, were ELL, or take off an L. And the first 3 letters stood for the Headquarters Intelligence Division, which was the South Korean spy agency at the time that Nagell was involved with the whole Willoughby FOI operation. Now, why the HID and the ELL, I don't know what the link of the South Korean intelligence agency was to all this, but it seems to have been something. Nagell goes to, what do we got? Yeah, we're still good. Mexico City. He comes back to the U.S. in 1959. He doesn't see Oswald again for 2.5 years. Oswald, of course, goes off to the Soviet Union. And then Nagell goes to work for the Beverage Control Board, Alcoholic Beverage Control Board in California, which was not exactly a front for the CIA, but had a lot of CIA operatives in it. And then in the fall of '62, he goes to Mexico City. And here, too, he gives names to the East Germans that he had not given before. One of them was Harry Johnson, who worked in the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City and was a CIA man under FBI cover at the embassy. He'd been told to do this by a man he calls only Bob, B-O-B, who I have come to identify over time as Henry Heckscher, who worked very closely with David Phillips and had been at BOB, the Berlin Operating Base, as they called it, in the mid-1950s. There's a lot on Heckscher in my second book, On the Trail of the JFK Assassins, which I have here. So Nagell is told to, because he has a history back in Japan of provocations, trying to make it seem like he was working for the other side. He's doing it again in East Germany. He was a disaffected army man, who'd seen all this stuff that would go down with the FOI and elsewhere, having participated in kidnappings and murders, and so he wanted out. And that's how he presented himself to the Soviet embassy in Mexico City in the fall of '62. It's an operation targeting a guy there with the GRU who they wanted to try to get to defect to our side. There's an awful lot of back and forth double agentry going on during this period. And Nagell also gives them, passes them some secrets that the CIA has given him, classified information related to the Russian missiles that are in Cuba at that time. And he's also given 2 assignments by the Russians before he leaves Mexico City, by the Russians. One is to keep an eye on this young guy named Lee Harvey Oswald, who's recently come back from the Soviet Union, completely independent from a plot that the Russians have heard about by a group called Alpha 66, a Cuban exile group, to assassinate President Kennedy. And he wants him to, they want him to monitor this plot as well. So he goes back, goes to Texas, checks into Oswald, gets inside of a plot that is originally targeting Kennedy with a bomb when he speaks at the Orange Bowl, addressing the returning Bay of Pigs prisoners at the end of '62. And there was talk of a bomb plot, a bomb being planted inside the podium there. There's another plot that Nagell then participates in. It's scheduled for June of '63 in Los Angeles. Again, targeting a guy with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, a guy named Vaughn Marlowe, who I interviewed. He's no longer alive, but he definitely knew Nagell, worked with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and was being considered as a patsy, being set up for an attempt on Kennedy's life at the premiere of PT 109, the movie about him in LA in the summer of '63. And then the third plot brought in Oswald. Nagell said that he was asked by his control agent to, in terms of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, after the LA plot didn't take off, to see, was there a Fair Play for Cuba branch in New Orleans? And that, of course, is what Oswald sets up that summer. There's a lot of questions and a lot of things that still haven't surfaced in these East German documents. I know that there are 39 missing days. Nagell was held there for 4 months, and he was released in the fall of '68 in a prisoner exchange, where Wolfgang Vogel, who was a major spy master at the time for the communists, was very involved in negotiating this. And shortly, then there's a story in the Washington Post, no reference to the bank robbery or anything, but attempted bank robbery, so-called, but to this guy being released at the border. And so Nagell's last 39 days behind the Iron Curtain, as it, and he told me that he wasn't only in East Berlin, East Germany, that he was taken to Moscow, and that he wrote out a confession, or if you call it that, but he wrote out all the reasons why he did what he did in walking into the bank. He had previously, just before he went in there, he'd sent a registered letter to J. Edgar Hoover telling him everything he knew about this plot. He'd alerted his superiors in the CIA. Obviously, nothing was done about it. So the CIA and the FBI are certainly complicit to that level, and I think much more. Nagell worked under Desmond Fitzgerald, ultimately, who was the head of Cuban affairs at that particular time. What am I? Oh, but he was taken to Moscow on the trail of JFK Assassins. I tell the story of going into the. I was in Moscow for an environmental conference in 1990. I've been covering the environment and trying to get the word out about climate change and the like for a number of years now. And while I was there, I actually knocked on the door of the KGB and trying to find out if they'd release whatever they had on Nagell to me. It was an experience that would take me half an hour to tell you, but you're welcome to read about it in the book. So what happened with Nagell ultimately was I stayed in touch with him. He eventually broke ties with me, was afraid to say much more. He had a lawsuit against the government to try to get a full disability retirement out of the Army, which he finally won, and then didn't have anything more that he would talk about at the time. My last conversation with him was shortly after my book came out in 1992, when one day he just called me out of the blue. And he didn't even know the book had been published. So I told him about it, and I was pretty surprised that he had no idea. But he said he'd never received any letters from me, which I tried to get to him to his P.O. box when I was writing the book to see if there was more he would talk about and let him know I was doing it. He never got any of those letters. And in 1995, I gave a talk in Washington before the Assassination Records Review Board and a number of other people. And the ARRB became convinced at that point to subpoena Nagell and in person and also get whatever records he had. And so I didn't know that they'd made that decision, but on the day that subpoena arrived in his box in LA, he was found dead in his apartment. I got a call from Pete Noyes, a broadcaster in LA that I knew, to tell me that Nagell had been found dead. I was in Boston at the time. I let Nagell's son know. I knew they were estranged. I didn't know his son really very well, but I called him and told him what had happened. His son went to LA, and the Assassination Records Review Board flew a guy out immediately. The police sealed off the apartment building that Nagell lived in. And they found this set of keys inside to a series of trunks that were at a Foot Locker in Tucson, Arizona. Because the reason Nagell had survived, he said, was because he had made arrangements that in the event of his demise, he would be some very sensitive information, to say the least, that he'd saved would be released. And he had said to his sister, I guess his niece, that one of these trunks, purple trunk, contained what everybody was looking for. So his son set off for Tucson. On the way, his son's apartment was broken into in San Diego, and everything was taken, ransacked. It wasn't taken, but everything was ransacked. He gets to Tucson and finds these trunks, the footlockers, and there was only one that was missing, and that was the purple trunk. So somebody got to him. I believe somebody killed Nagell, induced a heart attack. That's what they said it was, before he could be brought in before the Records Review Board. And so I met with his niece. I've continued to maintain a strong interest in this guy and what the truth is about the assassination, because we've never been told the truth. And certainly I do not believe it was a communist conspiracy of any kind, although it was made to look that way. And, you know, I think we're getting closer. We're inching closer to the truth as things like this East German file release comes out, and some of the new books that are happening. And there's a very important new book coming out in the spring by Hank Albarelli, who wrote a book on the mind control efforts by the CIA, MKUltra. And I just tell you now that it's probably the most significant book that's come out in a long time, and you should look for it. So I guess, what do we got? 20 of? I'll take questions if anybody's got some questions. Okay.
It'd be best if we just bring it up here.
Okay.
If you have a question you want to ask, come on up here.
The new one? I don't know what the title of it is. I don't know if they have a title yet, but the author is Albarelli.
How do you spell that?
Albarelli.
Hey, Richard. Who do you? I was taking notes madly. Who were the U.S. intelligence operatives that you think that that Nagell knew most well? You mentioned David Ferry, and then you mentioned like 5 others.
I think Henry Heckscher was his case officer. He knew David Atlee Phillips, who worked very closely with Heckscher in Mexico City. Heckscher was based in Washington, but spent a lot of time in Mexico City at that time. He's not a well-known name, but John Newman has written about him, documents about him in one of his new books. And so he's certainly one. And Nagell always referred to Desmond Fitzgerald. I don't know how personally he knew him, but he knew that he was running this operation at the top that involved Oswald. I personally think that there were 2 operations. One of them, I've come to believe this over the years, that there was a false flag operation, which was that there was going to be an incident in Dallas that day. Kennedy didn't know about it, but there was going to be, maybe there were going to be shots fired at him, and something was staged that would force Kennedy's hand to go after Cuba again at a time of great rapprochement between the 2 countries. And I think that that particular plot, which was being run by Fitzgerald, was, quote, hijacked by another group. That there were others within the CIA who knew about Fitzgerald's operation, and they took it over, brought in assassins. They included, you know, the Willoughby group, certainly perhaps Angleton. I don't have direct evidence of that, but I met Angleton, and I think he was certainly capable of it. And that's what happened that day. And I know Fitzgerald's reaction was his daughters said this, and that he was stunned by the fact that Kennedy had actually been killed. And then when Oswald was killed on Sunday by Jack Ruby, Fitzgerald broke down in front of the TV and said, "Now we'll never know." So that indicates to me that because Fitzgerald was well aware of Oswald. That, and maybe Oswald was sent in, as Judith says, I kind of think this is true, he was a CIA operative, he was part of this false flag operation, he was prepared to stop it, if he could, or help stop it. That's what I've come to think anyway.
So, sir, can you offer a perspective on Ed Tatro describing the train as essentially being driven by LBJ and Texas Oil and Associates versus it being more deep state or the hand in the glove of the deep state, whoever that might be? Who responds to who? Is the president really in charge of things? Maybe not, or is it those behind the intelligence? And how do they interface in the process?
Well, I think definitely that the H.L. Hunt oil family was involved, and they were right-wingers, but they, you know, I wouldn't say they were close to Johnson, but there were oil men who were, and Johnson came from that world. I personally don't believe Johnson, he may have heard something before the fact, but I'm not somebody who thinks he was responsible for the assassination. I think it was an operation that had been in place for quite some time, that it was military geniuses like Willoughby and CIA people like Dulles and Angleton, utilizing, you know, lower level operatives down to Cuban exiles, making it look like these exiles worked for Castro when they didn't. I believe the Angel's identity, which is not in one of my books, but if you look this guy up, I'm convinced this is who Angel was, is Herminio Diaz Garcia, who was a known hitman and had come out of Cuba. He'd been involved in the Bay of Pigs, then gone back to Cuba, and then come out again. So I'm pretty sure he was there, you know, that day, probably pulling a trigger, as I think Jean-René Suetre, who was a French assassin, was probably recruited by Willoughby. Maybe Willoughby going through Scorzeni, the Nazi who lived in, ex-Nazi who lived in Madrid. It was a well-orchestrated military-type operation that was covered up by different people for different reasons. I think the Warren Commission covered it up because they were told, hey, you know, we got evidence that these guys, Oswald and his associates, worked with Castro and the Russians, and we're going to have World War III, and we've got to just lay it on this guy, and that's it. That's one reason for a cover-up. The Fitzgerald arm of the CIA would have covered it up because they were involved with Oswald in a different operation. But the blame could easily be placed on them if they didn't, you know, just bury this thing. Hoover knew in advance. I know Nagell warned him. Hoover hated the Kennedys. So, you know, the FBI would cover it up. Also, Oswald worked for them as an informant. Maybe the CIA put Oswald to work for the FBI as an informant in order to ensure that the FBI would cover this up. Another possibility.
I'll be really quick. You said that Angleton, you felt Angleton was more than capable of it, and I'm just going to read about one little paragraph real quick and see if you agree with me. Okay, and that I wrote, I said, Angleton and his counterintelligence group were apparently all hard-drinking, cold-blooded bastards, according to participant Cord Meyer, but especially Angleton with his paranoia, extra-legal assassination orders, and ruthless, career-destroying CIA purges makes Dick Cheney look like a choir boy. I believed, and recently it was apparently confirmed, it was Angleton who ordered the hit on Marilyn Monroe. I believe he was also responsible for the deaths of Dorothy Kilgallen and, chillingly, his longtime family friend, the mother of his godchildren, Mary Pinchot Myers, and Dr. Mary Sherman, and was probably the person who ordered the unsuccessful hits on my California neighbor, JFK's mistress, Judith Campbell, who slept to the end of her life with a gun under her pillow. Do you think there's any possibility? He seemed to get off.
Yes, I do think that that's possible.
Just when he ugly stooped, it was ugly stooped. It was no longer the tall, dashing young OSS Parisian poet. He seemed to have, if not a sadistic, perverse, misogynist thrill to ordering the death of pretty women.
That I'm not sure about. Although the Mary Meyer murder, none of that would surprise me. I spent time with Angleton on 3 different occasions. I don't even know why he agreed to let me interview him. I was writing for the Village Voice, and he knew I was investigating the assassination as a journalist. But he used to wine and dine me in the Army-Navy Club in Washington. And he was a hard drinker. He drank his martinis, and he was a fly fisherman. He raised orchids. The guy was a genius. But he went out of his way to try and convince me that the real answer was lay in the files in Cuba and in the Soviet Union, and to, I was just beginning to investigate this in those days as a journalist, and then we'd sit at dinner, and he would say, he said to me, he says, he just dropped little things out of nowhere. He said one time, he said, I know who killed Sam Giancana. And I said, oh, really? I said, well, tell me, who was that? And he said, well, it was these guys with the mob, it had nothing to do with the CIA. And then he'd say, I know where Jimmy Hoffa's body is buried. I said, oh, really? Can you tell me that? And he'd say, you can't write this down. I mean, so he would, and he was full of crap, but he was really good at it, and he would try to get me drunk, and he never tried to recruit me or anything, but I just wondered, why the hell was this guy doing this? But he was one of the most fascinating characters, certainly, and I met a lot of fascinating characters, I'll tell you. But he was one of them, and he was capable, I think, of anything. The new book about him by Jefferson Morley called The Ghost is really, really good, too, and gives you an insight into how because Angleton controlled Oswald's file from the time he was in the Soviet Union all the way, through up to the end. And he was the main guy with Oswald's file within the CIA, along with the Western Hemisphere division that Fitzgerald ran. But it was Angleton that went way back with all this. And I think it was all part of a mole hunt, too. I mean, that's too big a story to get into. But I think Oswald when he went to the Soviet Union for the CIA, I think he was sent there to see who would connect with him. Because the CIA wanted to know who had penetrated their agency. And Angleton was obsessed with that. Angleton was a real paranoid guy. And some say Angleton himself might have been a mole, but I don't think so. Anyway, further question?
Mr. Russell, my questions would be about Charles Willoughby. Whether you'd be able to place him in context with other JFK assassination suspects, and also whether, since the man who knew too much, you've come up with additional evidence about Willoughby. Thank you.
Willoughby had lived in Texas after he retired. He published the Foreign Intelligence Digest, which he traveled. He was involved in many, many conferences, with the international right wing. He knew Otto Skorzeny in Madrid. He knew the H.L. Hunt family quite well. He was connected with Cuban exiles. There was a guy named Portuando who worked out of the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, who had turned out to be one of David Phillips's agents, who, the day after the assassination, was overheard, and it was taped by the Mexican police, making a call saying that the plan to get the Kennedys is in effect. Bobby is next, and he was one of Willoughby's close associates with the newsletter Willoughby put out at the time. And I think you'll find the new book coming out by Albarelli will have some things on Willoughby in it.
It's called Wormwood Exposed.
Wormwood?
Wormwood Exposed.
No, I don't. No.
Albarelli's book.
Well, maybe that's his second book. I don't think it's the new one, but anyway. But thanks. It might be. Yeah.
Yeah, in your book, you wrote about Eugene Dinkin.
Yeah.
He was sort of like a bookworm who worked on psychological sets based on everything that he read. And he sort of had foreknowledge of the assassination. And he also, when he went AWOL, he made sure that he was also in custody. What kind of parallel could we draw with Richard Case Nagell?
Well, there's definitely a parallel there. I mean, they followed him. They eventually threw him into a nut house. I met Dinkin in 1975 in Grand Central Station in New York. He was kind of out there by then. I mean, he was seeing, strange subsets of figures and all this stuff. But originally, he was a crypto operator in France, a code operator, and cracked some kind of code and put out this warning that President Kennedy was going to be assassinated latter part of November. It's going to be blamed on a communist or a Negro, is how he put it at that point. And then he went AWOL and went all over Europe to the various embassies telling this story. And I think that this story was significant later in what people within the CIA who may not have been involved in this, but they became aware of what was going on through Dinkin, and then took measures to see what they could do to maybe stop the whole thing. So Dinkin's important, but he was a strange little guy. I don't know if he's still around or not.
Hi, I just have a question and comment. The main thing is who is behind all of these people we're talking about. And I don't know what you know about Permindex. The World Trade Center is right near here. All this has to do with international trade and all that. And so there's people above the people we're talking about. And that's the big issue. And one thing that people may or may not know is James Jesus Angleton is buried in Israel.
He's buried in Israel? Is he? I didn't know that. Well, certainly. I mean, it was an international cabal, I guess you would say, in a sense. But it was carried out on this soil, and it was a coup d'etat. I mean, I have no doubt it was a coup d'etat. I mean, that's obvious from all the cover-ups afterwards with the Parkland doctors and the autopsy results and all those things. And Oswald was set up to take the fall. And I think that's one thing that is unequivocally true, but that there's a lot of people, with Permindex, Centro Mundial Comercial, who were possibly participants in this.
I wanted to ask about the visit to Sylvia Odio. One thing interesting about her is that her father was kind of a politically incorrect anti-Castro because he supported Castroism without Castro. And so was a visit to her in any way linked to an attempt to make them further their war on Castroism? Yeah,
I think it was. I think elements of, there were the Cuban exiles who were working with Oswald associated themselves with Hure, which was Manuel Rey's group that Sylvia Odio, went there. But they also were connected to Alpha 66, which was a much more radical group that Veciana was part of and Phillips ran. So, but I think it was made to look like that Odio visit could well have had to do with trying to point the blame at that more left-leaning Cuban exile group, if that's what it came down to. It gets really complex because people are trying to blame each other for this or set different people up in different ways, and I tell you, it is mind-boggling. Okay, thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Dick Russell, come on, give him a hand.